Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be diving into creativity, specifically with this book, The Creative Act, A Way of Being by Rick Rubin. You know, I, I've had a chance to look over those excerpts that you sent over, and honestly, like they're packed with all this interesting stuff, like how we create, where inspiration even comes from, and how to nurture that creative spark.
Yeah, it's a really great read, even for people who wouldn't normally think of themselves as like artists, quote unquote, like Rubin's ideas. You can really apply them to just about any part of your life if you want to get more creative.
Yeah, and that's honestly what really jumped out at me when I was reading it. Like Ruben says, we're all artists, constantly creating, whether we realize it or not. It's kind of like, whoa, hold on. I'm an artist just by living my life.
Yeah, exactly. Like just the way we filter information, the choices that we make, even how we arrange like our living spaces, like it's all creation. Rubin's just asking us to sort of be more aware of that, to like approach everyday life from that perspective like an artist would.
So it's not just about making, these big masterpieces, but it's more about bringing that artistic, that consciousness to everything that we do.
Exactly. And a big part of that is becoming aware of that creative energy that's like flowing through us all the time.
Yeah.
And Rubin gets into this fascinating idea of a source outside ourselves. Like that's where creativity comes from. We're not really like generating it ourselves. It's more like we're receiving it and then channeling it.
Okay, so that's a little out there for me, but I'm interested to hear more. Is he talking about like some kind of cosmic force or something? What exactly do you think he means?
It's open to interpretation, but think of it like this. Rubin used this analogy of clouds, like clouds transforming into rain, and then the rain becomes part of the ocean, and then it evaporates and turns back into clouds. So it's a cycle, kind of like creativity.
So instead of just like trying to come up with brilliant ideas out of nowhere, we're like tapping into this like a larger flow of inspiration that's always out there.
Yeah, exactly. Like we become these vessels, conduits for that energy. And that actually reminds me of this concept of flow state that like psychologists talk about. Have you ever felt that?
Mhm.
Like where you're so absorbed in something you're doing and like time just kind of disappears and the ideas just flow so effortlessly?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Well, researchers like this guy Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, they've actually found distinct neurological patterns in the brain that happen during flow states.
Wow, so there's like a scientific basis for this idea of like tapping into something bigger than ourselves. That's pretty cool.
It is. And that whole idea of the source resonated with me because it connects to like ancient concepts,
Yeah.
like the muse in Greek mythology. It seems like humans have always had this intuition that creativity comes from somewhere beyond our individual minds. You know what I mean?
That's crazy. But if we're all these vessels for creative energy, how do we actually like tune into it more and use it to create, well, I guess cool stuff?
Well, Rubin really emphasizes cultivating awareness, not just like of the world around us, but also our internal landscape,
Hmm.
like our thoughts, feelings, sensations. He suggests things like mindful walks in nature, just paying attention to even like the little details of everyday objects, basically training ourselves to really see the world.
So instead of just going through the motions, we're like really trying to be present, observant, and notice all the little things.
Exactly. It's like sharpening your senses, tuning in to the beauty and inspiration that's all around us, which like we often miss, you know,
Mhm.
because we're so busy or caught up in our heads.
Makes sense. But what about when we're feeling stuck? Like that well of inspirations run dry. Did Ruben have anything to say about how to get those creative juices flowing again?
Yeah. Well, one thing he suggests is this idea of like submerging yourself in greatness. Like really spend time with exceptional works of art, whether it's music or literature, visual art, whatever you connect with. Think about it. Like if you only ever read like clickbait articles online, then your sense of what makes good writing might be a little skewed, right?
Oh, for sure. My newsfeed is full of those crazy headlines, but I rarely feel truly inspired by them.
Exactly. But when you immerse yourself in classic literature, for example, then you develop this deeper understanding of what literary excellence actually is. And that applies to anything, right? Rubin even talks about food. Like if you regularly have exceptional, fresh, delicious food, then even fast food will probably taste worse to you.
Haha. So it's like you're calibrating your internal compass for what's truly good.
Exactly. And by surrounding yourself with greatness, then you're more likely to recognize it in yourself and in the world around you. And it can really fuel those creative aspirations.
I like that. It's not just about passively consuming stuff, but it's about actively shaping your taste and raising your standards for what you create.
Exactly. And I think that naturally leads into like another big piece of the creative process that Rubin talks about, which is self-doubt.
Ugh, Don't even get me started on that inner critic. I'm constantly battling that. Did Rubin have any advice on how to quiet those voices?
He does. He has some practical techniques,
Yeah.
like just labeling those negative thoughts as, just thoughts, not truths. Like, oh, there's that not good enough thought again.
Yeah.
He also talks about focusing on the process, not just the end product.
So instead of obsessing over like the final result, we should just enjoy the act of creating itself.
Yeah. And he also says to set low expectations at first. Just start small and experiment and give yourself permission to make mistakes. He even tells this great story about this artist who was struggling with self-doubt. And Rubin introduced him to this Buddhist idea of papancha, which basically means mental chatter.
Oh, I like that. So it's about recognizing that all that self-criticism is just noise, right? It's not necessarily true.
Exactly. And it goes back to that awareness thing. By becoming more aware of those negative thought patterns, you can start to detach from them. And then you have more space for like positive self-talk.
That's helpful. Instead of letting those doubts like completely derail you, you can just observe them and not give them so much power.
Right. And that leads to another interesting thing that Rubin brings up, this idea of collaboration. He says every creative act is a collaboration in a way, not just with other people, but like with the past, the present, and the future.
Okay, I'm not sure I follow you there. What do you mean by collaborating with the past, present, and future?
Well, he tells this story about this old man who prefers to like hand draw water from a well instead of using a pulley system
Wait, really? Why would he do that?
because he believes that all the effort and care that he puts into drawing that water, it like infuses the water with this special quality. It's a metaphor, you see, for how our intention and the energy we bring to the creative process becomes embedded in the final product.
That's beautiful. So it's like we're not just creating in a vacuum, we're building on the work of everyone who came before us and then leaving something behind for those who come after.
Exactly. We're part of this larger creative continuum, right?
Yeah.
Taking inspiration from the past, engaging with the present, and shaping the future through what we create.
Wow, I never thought of it like that. It makes you realize that even when we're working solo, we're never really alone in the creative process.
Yeah, for sure. And Rubin actually has a lot to say about like the practical aspects of collaborating with other people too, but maybe we can get into that a bit later. There's this other thing he talks about that I found really intriguing and maybe a little counterintuitive, which is this idea of setting temporary rules for a project.
Rules. I thought creativity was all about breaking the rules.
Right. Me too. But Rubin says that sometimes when you impose certain limitations, it can actually spark creativity. He calls them temporary rules because, they only apply to this one project. It's like giving yourself a creative challenge, working within a set of constraints.
Okay, but I'm still not sure I get it. It sounds like the opposite of creativity to me.
Well, imagine you're a chef and you decide to only use 5 ingredients to make a whole meal. That limitation forces you to get creative with those ingredients,
Okay.
right? And come up with dishes that you wouldn't have otherwise thought of.
Oh, I see. So by limiting your options, it forces you to explore new possibilities.
Exactly. And it reminds me of this film movement called Dog Me 95. Have you heard of it?
I don't think so.
Well, basically, this group of directors, they made this vow of chastity, as they called it, with all these rules that they had to follow for their films. Like, they could only shoot on location, no special effects, natural lighting only.
Wow. So they like deliberately limited themselves to see what they could do. That's wild. It makes me think of that writer, what's his name? Georges Perec. He wrote a whole novel without using the letter E.
Exactly. It's amazing what people can do when they set these constraints for themselves.
Yeah.
It forces them to think differently, find new solutions. And a lot of times, the results are super innovative.
Wow. Okay, I'm starting to see the value in temporary rules. It's like you're nudging your creativity in a certain direction and seeing where it takes you.
Yeah, and sometimes those detours lead to the coolest discoveries. Speaking of discoveries, Rubin talks about this other really interesting concept, which is the ecstatic point of reference.
Okay, that sounds kind of mystical. What is that exactly? Is it like a feeling or a state of mind?
It's both, I think. Rubin describes these moments of inspiration or insight, or even like awe, that energize and guide the creative process, like when everything suddenly clicks and you're just flooded with ideas or a sudden understanding of something. Those times when you feel totally connected to something bigger than yourself? It can almost feel spiritual.
Oh, I totally know what you mean. It's like when you're working on something and then bam, like a light bulb goes off and everything becomes crystal clear.
Yes. And those moments are super valuable because they like reference points. They give you a compass to guide your creative decisions.
So it's not just about chasing those moments, but recognizing when they happen and then using them to inform your creative choices.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And it makes me think about flow state again. Remember how we were talking about there being actual neurological patterns associated with flow? Well, there's research that suggests these ecstatic moments of inspiration, they might be linked to that same type of brain activity. Those bursts of insight and creativity that happen when we're totally in the zone.
Wow, that's really fascinating. So there's a scientific basis for tapping into those moments.
It seems so. And Rubin actually says that even though spontaneity is important, we can actually kind of cultivate those moments by establishing certain habits and rituals that support our creative process.
So it's about finding a balance between like structure and spontaneity.
Yeah, exactly. You need both. He suggests things like even just setting aside like specific office hours for your creative work, even if it's just for 30 minutes a day. It's about making that commitment to the process, even when inspiration isn't exactly hitting you over the head.
So consistency is key, even when you're not feeling particularly inspired.
Yes. Just show up for the process and trust that those moments of inspiration will come.
Okay, I'm starting to see some themes here. Awareness, embracing limitations, establishing rituals. It's all about creating the space for creativity to like really blossom.
Exactly. And that actually reminds me of this crazy story Rubin tells about AlphaGo. Do you remember that? The AI that beat the world champion Go player?
Oh yeah, what was it about again?
Well, AlphaGo actually made a move that like no human had ever thought of before because it wasn't limited by all the traditional ways of thinking about the game.
Yeah.
It approached it with a beginner's mind, with this sense of like openness and curiosity.
So even AI can teach us about creativity. That's pretty cool.
I know, right? And that story actually leads perfectly into the next part of our deep dive, where we'll be talking more about that beginner's mind idea and about how to overcome creative blocks and all that.
Okay, well, I can't wait to hear more. This is fascinating stuff.
That AlphaGo story, man, it really makes you think, like, how important it is to approach things with a fresh perspective, even when we think we know it all.
Yeah, it's kind of humbling, isn't it? This AI just comes in with like no preconceived notions and does something completely original.
Totally. And that's basically the essence of what Rubin calls beginner's mind. It's about shedding all those assumptions and approaching things with a sense of curiosity, like you're seeing them for the first time.
Okay, I get that, but how do we actually do that? Cultivate that beginner's mind, I mean.
Yeah.
Especially when we're so used to relying on our expertise.
Well, one way is to just shake things up a bit. Rubin talks about the power of changing your context, like your physical environment, the tools you use, even your emotional state. Step outside your comfort zone a little bit, experiment with some new approaches, and see what happens.
It's kind of like giving your brain a jolt, forcing it to think differently.
Exactly. And sometimes those unexpected detours lead to the most interesting discoveries. I remember when I was working on my dissertation, I hit this wall. Like I was just so stuck, poring over the same research, totally overwhelmed.
Yeah, I know that feeling all too well.
Yeah.
So what did you do? How did you get unstuck?
I decided to just change my environment completely. Instead of being cooped up in my office, I took my laptop to this park and started working there.
A park? Really?
Yeah, and it was amazing. I mean, just being surrounded by nature, breathing in the fresh air, it totally shifted my perspective.
And did it help?
Big time. Ideas just started flowing again. I actually ended up making some of my biggest breakthroughs while sitting on a park bench, believe it or not. It was like my brain finally had some space to breathe.
That's awesome. It really shows how just a simple change in scenery can make a huge difference. And it kind of reminds me of something else Rubin talks about, the importance of play in the creative process.
Oh, absolutely. He's all about approaching art with that sense of childlike wonder, letting go of the pressure to create something perfect and just having fun, experimenting, seeing what happens.
So less about the outcome and more about the journey, right?
Exactly. It reminds me of that Picasso quote, one about how every child is an artist, but the problem is staying an artist when you grow up. It's like we all have that capacity for creativity, but then as adults, we get bogged down with all this self-consciousness and fear of failure.
Yeah, totally. It's like we lose that sense of playfulness that comes so naturally to kids.
And that's what Rubin's trying to help us reclaim. He even suggests setting the bar really low at first, just to avoid getting trapped by perfectionism. He calls it making it up. Silencing that inner critic and just letting yourself make mistakes.
Oh, I love that. Giving ourselves permission to be messy and just experiment without judgment.
Exactly. And I think that can be so freeing, especially for people who tend to overthink things or get paralyzed by self-doubt.
Okay, so we've talked about beginner's mind and play. But what about those negative voices in our heads? The ones that tell us we're not good enough. Does Rubin have any advice for dealing with those?
Oh, for sure. He has a whole section on like tuning out those undermining voices, both internal and external.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing all the things that can sabotage our creative process, like self-doubt, obviously, critical feedback from others, societal expectations, and then figuring out how to filter out that noise.
So it's like creating a protective bubble around your creative space, where you can really focus on your own vision.
Yes, but it takes self-awareness. Being aware of those negative voices, those thought patterns, and how they affect your creativity. It's like shining a light on those hidden beliefs that are holding you back.
I'm really seeing how all these ideas connect now. Awareness, self-compassion, playfulness, tuning out negativity. They're all part of creating that mindset where creativity can flourish.
Totally. And remember, that source of creativity is always there.
Yeah.
Rubin says we just have to tap into it. He encourages us to look for inspiration everywhere, in the most ordinary moments, and to remember that creative blocks are often self-imposed. It's like we're choosing to disengage from that flow of creative energy.
Wow, that's powerful. It's like we have the power to choose, right, to open ourselves up to that flow or to block it.
Exactly. And that idea of choice actually ties back to those temporary rules we were talking about before. Remember how Rubin suggests imposing limitations to spark creativity? Well, those limitations are a form of choice too. You're choosing to direct your creative energy in a certain direction.
Oh, I see what you mean. So it's not about being bound by rules, but using them as a tool, like choosing to play a game with a specific set of parameters.
Exactly. And that reminds me of something else that Rubin explores, which is this idea of greatness. He challenges us to create art for its own sake, not for external validation or commercial success.
So creating something that's meaningful to you personally, regardless of what other people think.
Exactly. It's about detaching from the outcome and focusing on the process of bringing your vision to life. He says that true success is about the act of creation itself, not the rewards that may or may not come after.
That takes a lot of pressure off, doesn't it? Like you don't have to worry about pleasing everyone or meeting some arbitrary standard.
Totally. And I think it allows you to tap into a deeper level of creativity, one that's driven by passion and purpose rather than external validation.
Okay, I'm seeing how all these ideas are weaving together. They all contribute to creating a more, I guess, creative way of being in the world.
Exactly. It's like a tapestry. Each thread represents a different aspect of the creative process. And when you weave them all together, you get something beautiful and unique.
It's amazing, right? Like we've been talking about all these different aspects of creativity, but it always comes back to this idea that it's more than just making things. It's a way of being in the world, like Rubin says.
Yeah, that's really what he's getting at in the creative act. It's not so much about mastering techniques or anything like that. It's about cultivating that inner space where creativity can actually flourish.
And I feel like so much of what he's saying is about rediscovering that like childlike sense of wonder and openness that we tend to lose as we grow up.
Oh, totally. He even talks about how some of the most successful artists are like the ones who have managed to hold on to those qualities.
Yeah.
The curiosity, the playfulness, the willingness to just experiment without worrying about judgment. It's like they've tapped into that, eternal wellspring of creativity that's inside all of us.
Makes me think about something Rubin asks towards the end of the book. He asks, why make art at all? I think that's a question that a lot of us struggle with, whether we're professional artists or just, like to dabble in creative stuff.
It's a big question for sure. And I think Rubin's answer is really beautiful. He says that art is ultimately about connection. It's a way of sharing our perspective with the world and kind of like sparking something in other people, reminding ourselves that we're all connected.
So it's less about creating something in isolation and more about like reaching out, bridging that gap between ourselves and other people.
Yeah. And he even goes as far as to say that art is a reverberation of an impermanent life. Like it's a way of making our mark on the world, even if it's small, and finding meaning in, our brief existence.
Wow, that's deep. It's like our creative acts ripple outwards and touch other people in ways that we can't even imagine.
I know, right? And it really emphasizes that the point of making art isn't about achieving fame or fortune. It's about the act of creation itself, bringing your unique vision to life and sharing it.
So again, it's not about the destination, but about the journey, about the joy we find in the process of creating.
Exactly. And he reminds us that the process is inherently rewarding,
Hmm.
It connects us to something bigger than ourselves, lets us tap into those deep wells of inspiration, and gives us a way to express our own unique voice.
I like that. And it makes me think about something we talked about earlier, the importance of letting go of control, surrendering to the creative process and trusting that it'll lead us where we need to go.
Absolutely. It's like that metaphor he uses, the artist as a vessel, receiving and channeling creative energy from a source that's beyond themselves. It's about embracing the mystery and accepting that we don't always know where the journey will take us, but trusting that it'll be worth it.
Yeah, and that sometimes those unexpected twists and turns are where the most interesting stuff happens.
Totally. But it's important to remember that the creative process isn't always sunshine and rainbows.
Mm.
There are going to be challenges, setbacks, times when you doubt yourself and wonder if it's even worth it.
Ugh, yeah, tell me about it. I think every creative person goes through that. It's just part of the deal.
It is. But Rubin reminds us that those tough moments are often the catalysts for growth. It's in the struggle that we discover our strength and resilience.
So it's about embracing the whole journey, right? The highs and the lows, the inspiration and the moments when you're totally lost.
Totally. And at the end of the day, the creative life is a journey of self-discovery, exploring who you are and expressing that in the world.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive into the creative act, I'm curious, what stands out to you the most? What will you take away from this whole exploration of creativity?
For me, the biggest takeaway is that we're all creative beings. It's not just a gift for select few, it's part of what makes us human.
I love that.
I
It's
don't,
like we're all invited to tap into that potential, to make creativity a part of our lives, no matter what we do or how artistic we think we are.
and it's about enjoying the journey, trusting the process, and finding joy in creating without getting too hung up on the results.
So well said. And to echo Rubin's question, what reverberations do you want to create in the world? What mark will you leave behind? What legacy will you build through your own creative endeavors? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into creativity. We hope you found it insightful and inspiring. We'll see you next time.